Great. Mark, you can start whenever you feel like.
Okay, so this is one of my topics today. Um, this is cloudy-like operations, and so I've run into this in my managing all of my deployments in with Cinder, and um, so a lot of our deployments we're running low on space because it's being used quite a bit, and we're having to do a lot of what we call balancing for operations that I don't think really should be done manually by an operator. And in this case, a good example of that is extending a volume. Um, in each of our deployments, a particular backend that we have has multiple pools, and we try to always ensure that we have at least two or three pools within that particular backend or that driver instance that always has space that's available because we're constantly extending and adding more because we're running out all the time. Um, and so one of the operations that frustrates our customers is, for example, extending a volume. And the reason why I think this should not be what ends up happening is that a customer tries to extend their volume. That volume lives on a particular pool that won't allow any more space to be allocated against it. The scheduler says there's not enough space to allocate the extension that you have, right? But in that same back end, we have pools that are completely free and would be able to take that extension. So what we end up having to do is track down where this volume is, on which deployment and on which back end it exists on, which volume type, which pool it lives on, and then figure out where we can migrate that volume to manually. And then after we manually migrate that volume, then we tell the customer to try again. This whole process sucks. As a deployer, as an operator, Cinder should take care of this. In this case, Cinder could take care of it if it even tried to send a migration, an automatic migration of that failed extend through the scheduler. It would automatically migrate that volume to one of the other pools on the same exact back end because there's space for it as well as the extension. And then after the migration is complete, automatically call the extend again on that volume, and then it would be successful. And as far as the customer is concerned, all they did was called, I want to extend my volume. In terms of a cloud, you just expect these types of things to just work and not have to know that, oh, I'm out of space on that particular pool where that volume currently lives, even though there's plenty of other space elsewhere. Um, and so what I end up having to do is to do a lot of manual interactions with customers that are upset because they can't do certain operations, like in this case, extend the volume. Um, and so this has led me to this idea of automatic migrating of volumes for certain operations where it makes sense to do that. Um, Obviously, if there is no space anywhere within that particular backend, changing it to a different backend is a different issue because we want to make sure that the volume is still on the same backend. Um, and if that particular backend has no space on any of the pools, that's a different problem and the operation should fail, which is what it does now. Um,
You're making an assumption, right? That when you say the same backend, if I have a volume type, the volume type may be defining and explicitly say that you want it in a specific pool. So now it's not, so it would not be possible to migrate it if you pin the volume type to a specific pool, if I remember correctly, right?
yes, if you have a volume type for that volume that specifies a specific pool, basically a pool affinity, then you're stuck, right? There's
So
nothing
it's
you can
not
do.
that easy.
So,
Begin
but
it
in a
has
generic sense, Cinder itself doesn't support at all the ability to do this whatsoever, and that's really what I wanted to talk about. Is the idea of this automatic migration on certain operations where it makes sense for the customer because there's a lot of pain for customer and a lot of pain for me personally of having to manually fix these problems, which shouldn't be problems, because our volume types are specified such that we just go to a particular backend. We don't specify a pool, so it should automatically migrate, because that's the script that I have that does this fix for them. Basically, does this migration for them, and then does the extend afterward.
I have one question. When you add new pools, because if I understood correctly, you have one pool first. Now you start filling it up. Now you see, okay, I'm going to need more pools. You add a second pool or something like that. And now that second pool is mostly empty because everything is in the other one. Shouldn't there, as an administrator, you do some kind of rebalancing at that point so that you can, instead of having one that is too full and the other too empty, they kind of even out so that when somebody requests an extend, then it's going to happen. Because you can even do that with the volumes that are not being used, so there is not even an impact on the performance of those volumes. Or I'm asking because I have never operated a cloud. So this is me, God cannot know it.
Yeah. So in reality, ideally, yes, that would be great. But in reality, unfortunately, what we end up having to do is we have, in some of our most highly utilized backends or deployments, we have 20 or 30 pools, and they almost invariably always get filled up, and then we add 2 or 3 pools at a time to account for creating new volumes. But and that leaves all the existing pools in this kind of a stuck state. And the problem is that it would take forever to rebalance everything because there's so much data that has to get moved around. So it doesn't make sense to completely rebalance all the time when new pools are added, because the majority of the time, the volumes that are being used don't really ever change. They don't need to be migrated. They don't need to be moved to be extended. It's only on a per volume extend basis where we need these actions to take place. Backup is also another one of these examples in our particular driver that we use, which is a heavily modified VMware driver. That backup fails because the first thing it does is it tries to create a clone of that volume, so that way it can create a consistent backup, and that clone fails because there's not enough space on the pool where it currently exists. So this is another case where we would like to be able to migrate it to a pool that has space for it and the temporary volume of the clone. So there's other operations that it would be nice if Cinder had a mechanism to decide, based on some criteria, based upon the particular action, whether it can automatically migrate that volume after an initial failure to try again. We also do migrates during attaches too, which is crazy, but at times we have to migrate a volume prior to attaching it. So if we had this mechanism in place, we could reuse that mechanism.
The attach case, I understand the other two cases, but not the attach case, because the backend doesn't have enough LANs to export or something like that, or why would you need to migrate it for attaching?
Because VMware sucks. That's basically the answer. VMware is terrible, and so I don't want to get into that, but it's a VMware problem. Let's just say that we have to migrate a volume to a completely different, effectively deployment of Cinder to accommodate limitations within VMware, and that we don't know until attach time that we have to migrate it. It's a really long, convoluted explanation that I could get into, but that's not the purpose of this talk. Really, I was trying to get some feedback with respect to, does it make sense for Cinder in general to take care of some of these cases when it could? And you don't know until you send it to the scheduler and look at the criteria, as well as look at the particular actions being taken or being attempted on a volume. And it would help end users and administrators like me quite considerably because I spent a lot of my time dealing with this, and I have to actually come up with some kind of a hack within Cinder to accommodate this anyway. And I'm going to do it. It's just a matter of, you know, can I get some feedback from the rest of you guys on the direction and whether it would be acceptable upstream to accept this? And the initial thing that I'm going to attack is the extend problem.
I just have okay, let me start. I think it makes sense the case you are explaining. Now my concern, one said that the feature seems kind of reasonable. The attached one, I must admit that that's hard sell for me. Kind of moving the volume because of an attach is harder. But I don't know if we could implement it in a way that it could be done. We can look at that later. But I think there are a couple of things, for example, that only would make sense if the backend, it has a efficient way to the cloning, the moving between pools. If moving between pools takes 1 hour, and as a user, if I request an extend and it takes an hour, it would seem weird, right? Although we could do a user message to report, yep, we're on it. It's going to take forever. Wait for it. Something like that.
Yes. So the flip side of that same coin, I totally understand what you're saying, and we have other problems within Cinder for long operations as well, and that's why I redid the whole backup process. But in case of this particular use case for users today, it makes even less sense to them because they're just asking for a little bit more space, and you're a cloud, and you're saying, "I'm sorry, I can't do that." Well, you're not much of a cloud. If I have to get intervention in place to talk to an administrator to ensure that I add another 3 gigabytes to my volume, you know.
As a cloud, if you request to extend and it takes 3 hours to extend, you would also say, what joke is this? Right?
Yeah.
So it would need to be for drivers that report, I am efficient. I can do this efficiently, moving from one pool to another. I think the RPD driver, for example, can do it efficiently, and probably there are other backends that they can either do it in the background, do it efficiently, do it transparently. I don't care. It's basically, yep, you can consider it done in a matter of seconds, 1 minute tops, thing like that, right? Because otherwise, if you're doing a full migration with the generic path of doing DD, this seems kind of crazy, at least to me.
It does seem kind of crazy, but that's really the only way to make it work. And from a customer's perspective, you know, the two scenarios are not ideal, but I in my opinion, the cloud provider should be able to handle this particular case, regardless of whether it takes, you know, 2 seconds to do it or 2 hours, depending upon the size of your volume.
I think the picture would get a bit complicated. I'm not saying that I don't like it. I'm just thinking about, for example, it's different if you're going to go with the generic way, because if you're going to do a DD, you might as well, instead of create and extend, you just create it slightly larger, the new size, and move it, right?
Yes. In terms of the end user customer, they don't really care, right? They just want to have their volume bigger. Make it happen, really. And that's kind of the point.
But one of the reasons I think when we try to not, for migration retypes, we make it sure that the user knows about it, is the performance impact. And also because the number of concurrent operations that could trigger this could have a high impact on other customers. So if suddenly you get a flood of, every single extend request, there are 20, they all need migration, you suddenly have 20 moving 20 pool volumes, out of there. And that's a lot of data. You suddenly have a lot of less data, right? Available network bandwidth, sorry,
Yeah,
right?
that's a problem today with just generic migrations. So
Yeah, but usually generic migrations are triggered by a system admin that can make them five at a time, doing in off times. They can play with it, right?
theoretically, yes, but in practice, migrations are happening all the time because of space limitations issues. At least in all of my deployments in the 20 plus clouds that I have, we're constantly migrating because of the space limitation issue, and our limiting factor is the ability of which we can add new storage, which is incredibly expensive to do. But if we're able to do it in small chunks, then we can do that. But in the case of doing these migrations, they happen all the time. They are as often as attachments happen effectively, and so I guess it kind of proves your point that the migrations themselves can be expensive to do. We have to limit the number of them, of these automated in this specific case where we would be automatically migrating things that to handle these particular use cases, which could exacerbate the issue. But we don't have a choice at this point.
And for the future, thinking about making it so that it has less impact on the cloud itself, on the performance. If I was thinking and I didn't have to implement the feature, I would think, okay, so this could be smarter and say, okay, you have asked me for 1 more gigabyte. Your volume is, or 10 more gigabytes, I don't care. But your volume is huge. It's 10 terabytes. So moving your volume is hell. But I have this other volume that nobody has touched for a week. Let's move that one, and it's not even in use. And that will give me the size that I need for your volume. So I will start moving the other volume, pause your extend, and once the other volume is out, I have the space to extend your volume. That would reduce the impact because huge volumes would not have that much problem, right? You wouldn't have to move it whole.
Yes, but it still has the problem of needing an administrator to deal with customer complaints and issues because I
I'm
don't know which volume.
about the feature. Let's say we implement it. Should we also consider that as in doing it more efficient instead of just moving the volume that needs the space, moving the volume that has not been touched for a while that could give me the space that I need?
Which volume do you move? Out of the 20 data stores, which volume do you move and
Okay,
where?
have I have in pool one a volume that I want to extend. There is no space. It is a 10 terabyte volume, and I want 2 more gigabytes. So I go look into that pool, which is the one I needed space to, and I see which volumes would give me that space if I move them, so that I can kick them out because they are smaller and it's faster to move them than to move the one you have requested. Because yours is 10 terabytes and you just want 5 gigabytes. For your 5 gigabytes, I can kick a 5 gigabyte volume out of here and give you the space you requested. So I'm thinking if we implement it, should we also look into this kind of things so that it is less impactful? Or should we just not try to be too smart about it, too fancy?
Yeah, so I like your idea. Um, I'm not sure exactly how to implement it in our particular case because in terms of our specific case, we don't have a way to migrate from the Cinder API attached volumes. The VMware driver doesn't support migrating attached volumes. It only supports um, volumes available, which sucks, and that's a problem with the VMware driver and our problem. But so in the case of if we had your implementation in place, it wouldn't work for us because almost all of our volumes are attached. Um, and you'd still have to wait for that migration to complete regardless before you tried to do the extend. So in the case of looking for a particular volume that is only small enough size to accommodate the extension, I guess, is what you're looking for in this case, right? To move that because it would be less time to migrate that volume in particular. Um,
Well,
it
that's
gets
some.
complicated because if that migration fails, because it can't be moved because it's attached in our case, then we're kind of hosed. But a migration in general is going to have that problem anyway. So even if we implement my implementation, because most of the time the volumes that are needing to be extended are attached to. So I guess it depends on your case is more of a case of rebalancing and moving somebody else instead of the volume that's being asked to be extended.
Yeah, in my mind, the feature could be automatic rebalancing of your pools within a backend that they can be, because that's one way I would look at it, like automatic rebalancing. And
That would be problematic for us.
yeah, I see it. Yeah.
Because we typically only add 2 new pools for a particular backend, and we have 20 other pools that exist, and they're almost always full. And I recognize that those other pools being full are going to cause other problems with backups and snapshots and stuff like that. So an automatic rebalancing would be nice to have in general, but that almost seems like a tool that's separate from Cinder, that knows the internals of Cinder, or maybe
I
it's another Cinder service, if you will.
named it incorrectly. By automatic is automatic per needed, only if needed, as not automatic as with Ceph. You add a pool, it automatic. No, not. It's you try to extend, it cannot extend. I don't want to fail because, like you said, this is a cloud. The user
Yeah.
doesn't care about how I have. If the volume type allows it, it should complete. It may take a while, it's not great, but it should not fail at least. So it automatically balances a bit the volume so that it can fit. But
Yes,
if
I
it's
totally agree.
touch, then it's for your case, I don't know how this would.
That's our problem. I
Okay.
guess what concerns me about your mechanism is that you're moving a volume from somebody else that could be a totally separate project, and if that migration fails for that particular volume, then another customer is affected by that failure, and they didn't initiate anything, and then all of a sudden their VM having problems with their volumes that are attached, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
with
really,
no, sorry, with the generic approach, like we shouldn't have a problem with like migrating volume since we at least wait for the like the transition to fully complete before like exchanging like states and make sure it's. But there might be a problem with DDs, so yeah,
You can't guarantee a
yeah,
migration is going to be
yeah,
successful.
yeah.
You
Yeah,
cannot.
yeah. Without like literally like hashing files and comparing, no, you can't. Yeah,
You could have a network problem, which we run into
yeah,
all the time as well. And I'd rather that affect the volume that is trying to be operated on to begin with than some other customer's volume.
yeah, yeah. You would have two customers like unsatisfied.
Yeah, I have one
So yeah,
customer upset initially, now I have two.
yeah, yeah,
Yep.
yeah. But yeah, I really like Gorka's idea. I think we would need to yeah. DDs would be really a problem, but maybe like thinking about like I said, like maybe considering this approach only when we have like a storage that have like a efficiency copy or that can validate internally its consistency, then maybe we could implement this case only for storages that can like uh, make sure it um, the transition really occurred or can provide some guarantee. I don't know.
Yeah, similar to what we usually have. We have the generic mechanism and the optimize. If the driver says it cannot do the optimize, we do the generic. And like Walter is saying, in this case, the generic would be, I just moved your volume, which is the one that you want. And we could even set it as a feature, as a flag, as in, yep, don't try to be smart, just do the basic thing or whatever. But yeah, I think that trying the feature in itself, being able to be smarter and not fail because of this, when you can accommodate based on the volume type, it makes total sense. So yeah, I think for the extend and things like that, I would be okay to do that.
Yeah, so my initial approach is to just attack the extend case. But another really important one for me is doing backups, which backups are failing a lot for a lot of reasons. And some of it has to do with this particular instance where the driver tries to issue a clone on that particular volume to create a temporary clone that it can actually do the reading from while the attached volume is still being written to, so we can get a consistent backup. But that clone fails because there's not enough room on the same pool that exists on, right? So I guess you could try and create it elsewhere, but then you still have to copy the data to a different pool. So cloning and snapshotting on the existing pool is what we do now, or try to do now. And in this case, I would migrate it to another pool that actually has space to contain the original volume as well as the clone itself.
Couple of questions. Is the failure, I assume it's failing on the scheduler, is it failing on the basis of available space, real available space, or perceived available space in the scheduler? So the scheduler assumes there is no space, or there isn't actual space there.
So yes and no. VMware sucks. So in some cases, VMware is reporting that it has space when it actually doesn't. So the scheduler says, yeah, you can do that, and then it tries to do that, and then it can't. And that's a VMware problem, and this kind of leads me into my next topic, which I won't dive into just yet, but it kind of ties in with this a little bit with respect to the reporting of free space. But an initial solution to this, in my mind, is to migrate that volume prior to doing a backup. And backups, when people are doing backups, they don't care. All of our customers schedule our backups like everybody else pretty much does. They assume that it can be done in the middle of the night, and that's when they all fail as well, which makes it hard to get logs and track down problems with respect to it because they happen in the middle of the night for everybody. But if I was able to automatically migrate that volume to another pool that actually had plenty of space, then this problem would happen for me.
The thing for backups is that in theory, if it's failing the scheduler because it is trying to get the available space instead of understanding that it's a thing, copy and write clone, a snapshot or something that doesn't actually take up space, then we can tweak the scheduler to check the flag that we have, which is uses quota. Basically, is this a temporary result? So if you're cloning, doing a clone operation, something like that, you should not even bother checking the available space if the backend is not actually moving data. Just doing a thing copy, you can do it, just go ahead, I don't care, because it's not going to use any space and I'm going to delete it immediately. So it's fine. But if the problem is that something else, that there is no space or something like that, I don't think that the volume should be moved. It's kind of weird. That's why the drivers can report whether you want to use a snapshot, a clone, which one is the one that it's efficient for you, so that that one is used.
Yes, in normal cases, I tend to agree with you, except on 2 points. One is that drivers don't really report how they do their cloning or snapshotting. They just implement the function. They don't say, yes, when I implement a snapshot, it doesn't actually take space, so it's okay to create temporary snapshots to do operations on for reads. That's one problem. The second is some drivers. I forgot what the second was. um, yeah, I don't remember now. Brain fart.
The first one we can tackle because we can make drivers report this information so the scheduler can make more smarter decisions regarding this. Knowing that it's temporary and it doesn't consume space, I don't even care if there's room in this backend or not. Just create it. Go ahead. So the scheduler not prevent it. But if the backend actually needs to copy the data and there is not available space, then yeah, we have a problem. But
So yes, I tend to agree. In the case of the VMware driver, it's the worst case scenario, which is we don't know until we actually try it, which way we're going to get it. Meaning we don't know if it's going to take up space, or if we have to duplicate the volume, or whether we can actually do a what VMware calls a linked snapshot, which doesn't take up space. We don't know until we actually try it. And the driver itself internally doesn't really expose that. It just happens to be a deep buried VMware problem.
in
So in the case of my implementation, I have to always assume that it needs a full copy.
in one thing, it depends on where the volume is created, or it depends on the specific volumes. It depends on when you request it, or I mean, is it something that can be added to the metadata of the volume so that the scheduler can know it, or it will depend on now it would be able to do it, tomorrow maybe not. How does that work?
It's kind of the latter, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, in that case,
Deeper the case, which is
in that
VMware,
case,
which is total garbage, but it's the case that I have to account for regardless. So
that case, I would say that we could implement the efficient movement, but I would say the feature for backups should include the option for optimized backups. Let's say we would have to make drivers be able to report. I do thin. I could do fast and cloning and a snapshot don't consume space. They should be able to report it. And the driver in those cases, it doesn't bother with the temporary ones and goes ahead. If they say, nope, I don't do, I will spend the space, then the scheduler can do like in the stand. He can say, okay, I'm going to need the space. There is no space. Let me move it before I do it. That way it accommodates your case where you actually have to move it, but other backends that can do it in a more efficient way, they don't have that problem. We solve both problems at the same time.
yeah, in our case, it's VMware is doing a volume vMotion from one data store to another data store, so it's efficient in the respect that VMware handles all of it and deals with the state changing and the rights to it and all that stuff automatically. But it still takes time for that operation to complete. So that's the smart way would be the way that the VMware driver would implement it. In this case, it would just be a migration, which turns into a vMotion. But
When I meant this, not smart, I meant efficient way is, for example, for RBD would say, okay, if you request for a clone, I will do it fast. I will do it. It will not take up a space. So if it's a temporary resource, don't even look into the scheduler if there is room for it. I can tell you there is going to be room. Don't worry about it. But another driver, the VMware, would say, I'm going to need the full space to do this operation. So the scheduler would say, okay, can I get the space? Nope, you cannot get the space because there is no available space. Then it would go the other way. Say, okay, then I need to move the volume prior to doing this. And it would do like the step. Make the request, migrate, and then do the backup, proceed with the backup.
So in this case, if we had a new capability that was being reported in volume stats for a particular volume driver and the pools, it could specify in there somehow that it needs the full space whenever it does a snapshot or clone.
Exactly. In that way, we can accommodate your case, which is even for backups, if there is no space, well, would accommodate one of your two cases. Because you have another case where the VMware's driver says that there is a space and there is no actual space. That one would still fail, but at least the other one, the reporting, the one where it doesn't fit because you cannot create it and it's not going to fit because there's no free space, that one would actually get migrated.
Yeah, that would turn into an attempt to migrate. And if there's no space anywhere else, that migration would fail and everything would bubble up correctly in that case.
So that way, I think we could accommodate half of what you need.
So in terms of how I'm going to approach attacking this is the extend problem first. The backups are not as high a priority because it's not as frequently requested, and the failures, I can handle those on a case-by-case basis still. But the extends are an unfortunate use case in this case. So I will try and put up a pull request or a Git review for that in the next month or so, hopefully, in terms of extend attempting to do a migration after failure and then see how that turns out.
Sorry, again, I may have misunderstood. I thought that it wouldn't be after failure. I thought I understood that it's going to do the extend and the scheduler says, nope, that's not going to happen. And because it sees that there is no free space, and then it does a migration before even trying to do the extend. But now I am understanding correctly that it tries the extend fails, and then it tries. So where is the extend failing? In the volume service or in the scheduler?
The scheduler.
Oh, okay, then it's fine. Yeah.
Yes, the scheduler knows that the existing pool cannot handle the extend request whatsoever. So it just immediately fails because it's an extend operation. So in that case, it fails in the scheduler, and the API calls the scheduler to attempt this, and then we'll recognize that it fails and then try to do the migration. And if that fails, then everything's off, right, at that point. And we're right back where we are today, which is, in this case, it can't work because there's no space anywhere for it, and that's a different problem.
Sounds good. At least to me,
Okay.
I haven't left anybody else talk, so maybe somebody else want to say something.
Yeah. So I guess the idea here is that it's something new with respect to Cinder, because traditionally we try an operation, and if it fails, it just fails, and you're done. You have to deal with it on your own, kind of thing. And this is kind of the first very simple use case of Cinder trying to be smart in attempting to resolve a failure that it theoretically could resolve for the end user itself, instead of making someone contact the administrator and then, going through that whole chain and making the administrator figure out why it's failing, which it's because in this case it ran out of space, and then the administrator migrating it and then contacting the customer back again saying, okay, retry. It'll work this time. Trust me. Which is literally what I do. So, yeah.
One thing that I also want to say that in newer releases, Rayad added, for example, for the backup errors that you say that happen at night, he added a lot of user messages. So now at least they will be able to tell you the request ID and things like that, and they will see an error in they can check themselves next morning. Why did this fail? They check, give me user messages, and they will see them for the backups. It's not.
Yeah, I saw that when I was rebasing my asynchronous backup rewrite. Those messages would be very helpful. But I'm still stuck on train. So that's a different problem of upgrading. But anyway. Okay.
So
All right. So
one question.
in general, we're not objecting to this idea of, for this particular use case, some mechanism of which we implement a migration. And if we want to be smarter about how to accomplish that later, we can do that, just changing the internals of the logic of this migration process. Okay, cool.
So one thing I want to ask regarding like properly documenting it, since it has a lot of cases regarding the extending volume, the backup case. So will you be writing a spec as well for this? Are you
Yeah, I
planning to
can.
do that? Okay,
Yeah.
then that would be great. Like we can finalize the design there. Okay, I think
Yep.
we have an agreement here. Uh, okay, I will just add the action item.
Yeah, this is probably something for the spec, but I'm wondering whether, so this is one of those operations where we return a 202, right? Just say accepted. I wonder if we should return some type of, I don't know if you can do this or not, be some type of message saying, like, if it's a terabyte volume, well, we don't know if it's going to require a migration yet. Somehow we could get some info to the user to say, go grab some coffee because this is going to take a while, instead of them going crazy. I don't know.
We have user messages, and we can create a generic one. Operation
Yeah,
action. It's going to
it
be a
doesn't
lot.
have to be an error. Yeah. Well, that would right. Okay. 'Cause, yeah, I always think of those as reporting error conditions, but you're right. It could just report hey, watch out. That's a good idea.
We could even reuse that same message for retypes that are going to take a while because yep.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay.
Do those
All right,
user messages come over the Cinder client, or is it only Horizon showing those?
You can
Well, you have
query.
to request them from the
We
Cinder
have a
client.
command for showing the user messages.
Okay, I'm unfamiliar with that.
Yeah, they don't show up automatically. I guess Horizon's probably polling for them, and we'll show them to you.
Yeah, regarding the user messages, I also have patches to have the mechanism which I implemented in the backup for the retype migrations and other resources as well. So I will just rebase onto it if people would want them for
Okay.
those things as well. Like it will make the user messages, creating the user messages quite easier.
Do you have an example of running that command? What is it? Cinder client command, I presume.
Suppose it's microvision 3.3, but I will have to find the command.
Okay.
Yeah, I found the command. Sorry for keeping everyone idle. So I will just paste it in the chat. Not sure if it's visible or not. I will put that in the channel as well. So okay, so I think we are finalized on that Vault will be writing a spec, and we can finalize the design there. So
Sounds good.
we can move on to the next topic. So Jay, can you press the spotlight button again?
Done.
Thank you.
Ta-da.
So again, it's your topic, Vault, so you can go ahead.
Okay. So I have been working on this one for a while now, talking with Brian a little bit about it, but in the process of maintaining all of these deployments of Cinder and dealing with a lot of space utilization problems, basically running out of space at times, it's kind of exposed some things within Cinder that I eventually tracked down to some issues with discrepancies inside the scheduler itself and how it's actually calculating the available or virtual free space for a particular request. And the simplest is if you look at the capacity filter versus the capacity where, they calculate the same value in different ways, which leads to different values at different times depending upon what the numbers are and how low, especially in the case where you get to a very highly utilized pool. So that led me to trying to unify the differences between the two and resolve the algorithm of how these capacity factors are created. Brian was so good to show me a doc that was written or a spec that was written back in Queens that actually defines all of the different capacity factors. Like what's the difference between available capacity versus total capacity versus free capacity, all that. And so what I tried to do was implement a new function in Cinder utils that actually calculates each of those individual factors of the capacity based upon those definitions. And then broke each one of those out into a dictionary that can be returned and used. And I tweaked the capacity filter to use all of these values instead of calculating them manually themselves. And the capacity where uses them now as well. So it's calculated once and used in different places. And the other aspect of this that I would really like to do as well, which is a follow-up to this code, is have Cinder report these capacity factors in the pool stats that it's returning. So basically what I do on a daily basis is I have to look at all of the pools in all of our deployments and determine if I need space somewhere. More space, additional space in a particular backend, in a particular pool. So from that, I wrote a Prometheus exporter that basically is deployed in every region, every deployment of Cinder, and every certain periodically calls the pool stats, collects that stats, recalculates all of those capacity factors, because Cinder doesn't provide it, and then sends alerts so that way our ops team can automatically add new storage as it's getting low before it runs out. So that way we always have capacity available for customers to use. So in that process, I had to figure out, well, what's the algorithm for calculating these capacity factors? And so that led me to this document that Brian pointed out, which led me to changing Cinder to implement this function. And then I had to pull that function into all of my other tooling that I use externally to calculate the same values to determine what to do in a particular backend, whether I need to add space or what's the current worldview in a particular deployment. So my follow-up to the patch that I currently have, I actually have two patches available. One is to add this new capacity factors algorithm, which returns a dictionary of all of the individual capacity factors that are described in that document. And the other is to fix a bug with respect to calculating the allocated capacity. And what I want to do is, after this merges, if everybody likes this, is to actually do a follow-up patch that actually reports the capacity factors in the pool stats that the API has. That way, Cinder is the definitive answer on what the worldview, the scheduler actually sees and uses in calculating the next provisioning request. Cinder should be the definitive answer. And the reason why this is important is because our ops guys look at our particular back end and they say, hey, there's plenty of space available. But from Cinder's perspective, there's no space available because we have reserved percentage, which removes some of the total space being reported by the back end from being utilized at all. So I have to go through this discussion on a daily basis, telling the guys, well, Cinder sees something different than what you see on the particular back end, and here's what Cinder sees. So that's kind of one of the reasons why I want to get this in and have Cinder report these factors itself. So that way external tooling can make the decisions based upon what Cinder thinks it has available to it on a particular pool to provision or not, if that makes sense.
This new feature brings me to something that we discussed a couple of PTGs ago, and I remember clearly you only use one scheduler. So for you, it is a single source of truth. For anybody deploying three schedulers, it's three different views of the world. As we know, the schedulers are not in sync, so it's a mess, and it
Yes.
does not help anybody else.
If you deploy Cinder in that way, it's a possibility. But at least if we reported this back, whatever version that answered at that particular time would still be a source of truth, and a better source of truth than actually looking at the back end's numbers themselves, because those are almost always be different. So
Yeah.
there's other problems. There's other problems within Cinder and the scheduling and the tracking of the allocated space. That is a totally separate discussion from what I'm trying to accomplish here, which is twofold. One is to correct a bug that we have in Cinder where we have two different places calculating the same thing and getting different results, which affects provisioning requests. And also having Cinder provide a source of truth as to what it sees at any instance of time. And if we have multiple schedulers, the API has to decide which one to ask, and that's a different problem, right? But right now, there's no source of truth other than what the actual particular backend is reporting, and then you have to manually calculate all these factors from that yourself, and you have to know what those factors are within Cinder and know what the particular config options are, such as the reserve percentage as well as the max over subscription ratio, you have to pull that out somewhere. And so that's kind of the problem that I have right now.
To that
So
thing that you're suggesting, I would add as a field. This is we'll probably discuss it in the spec, but I will forget. So I will add who the scheduler that is supporting that information is, so that people that have free schedulers, if they are out of sync, can make a bunch of requests and get the world view of the different schedulers
right,
because they get. Yep.
what happens today if you have multiple schedulers deployed and you say, "Give me the pool stats"?
Depends on who receives it.
I see. So it's random at this point.
Yep, it's round robin, so it depends on who receives it, who's the next.
So that's a totally different problem, right? In my mind, is
No,
one, we've got to report this, and then we've got to decide who's reporting it, if not all or one or a subset or whatnot.
no, it would still be random. I just said with the information, like you say, this is the scheduler's worldview. Say who the scheduler is. Just add a field. It's a key. Who am I? I'm the scheduler. My name is because the schedulers report. They have a name in the service list, so just report that name. So I can tell who is telling me this.
Okay, yeah, that's
Small
that's
change.
easy to do. Yep. And that's in the follow-up patch that I haven't written yet, but I've started to explore. But my initial, with respect to this topic, is to get the initial fix in place for the unification of that calculation of those capacity factors themselves that will be utilized by the scheduler and the weighers. Um, and the other problem with respect to this, I don't think I've mentioned yet, is that Cinder itself is not tracking the allocated capacity very well at all right now. There's certain operations where we're not updating the allocated capacity at all. And that's really bad because for thin provisioning, we need to make sure that the allocated capacity is accurate, because that is the factor that is used for determining whether there's space available or not, and not the reported free space. For thick provisioning, free space is used. For thin provisioning, the allocated capacity is used. So operations like extend don't update the allocated capacity. Migrate does not, and we do a ton of migrations in our deployment because we sometimes do migrations during attaches. Crazy, I know, but it's still it exposed this problem. So I have another set of patches that fixes this. One which I think Gorka and I already talked about with respect to what happens at init host time when the volume service comes up, because previously we're only tracking available and in use volumes, not anything else. And so I have a fix for that in which tracks any volume that has a host specified. And I have a follow-up patch that fixes the update of the allocated capacity for those other three actions: migrate, extend, and there's a group delete that incorrectly changes the allocated capacity for the aggregate, but not individual pools. That's in place.
Could you? I know that two of the patches you have it added to date, but maybe just since they are all around the same logic, once I start reviewing one, it will probably take me less time to do another one consecutively because my mind is already thinking into this madness that is dynamic of everything. So if you could just list them, all the ones related to that probably would be helpful. Or
Okay.
if all your patches currently are about this, I will just filter by your name, and that's enough.
Okay. Yeah, I think I have several other patches that are outstanding that have nothing to do with this, but most of them, my recent patches are related to this. One of the other things that I don't think I talked about here is the not tracking allocated capacity for temporary volumes. Yeah, we don't do that at all, and that's terrible. I'm really surprised that this stuff is in this bug is in place, but one of my patches fixes that as well. Um, I think for one of the operations where we do some temporary volume creation and then deletion, and I think it's a clone, the generic clone. Anyway, it still occupies space in the back end, and we're not tracking it at all. Um,
Or not. Most backends, it doesn't. That's what we were discussing before. Most backends, when they clone, they don't do anything. It doesn't take up a space.
yes, but this is the generic cloning where we're actually creating a copy and copying the bits, and some of the other temporary operations that we have, I've noticed as well. And in order for the schedule to make an accurate decision on whether it can create a volume, it needs to have a more accurate than we currently have version of the allocated capacity, and it's hardly being tracked or managed at all inside of the volume manager, which is surprising to me. But for someone that runs low on space all the time, it's exposing some of this stuff. So I guess that makes sense why I'm the one finding it now. um, so those patches are up. Please look at them. I would like to get this stuff in as soon as possible because I'm going to merge them in my own version of Train and use them as well. And I just want to make sure that the naming of some of the dictionary items are the same, so that way I don't have to change it and change my tooling later. I'd much rather have my fork of Cinder and the upstream in sync, so that way when I do upgrade and get in sync, that I'm okay.
So what I haven't gone through the specs that was proposed in Queens, but is it implementing the same design? Like, is it changing few things here and there, or the things that were mentioned in the spec were not properly implemented? That's why we are having these issues.
So there's no spec for this, and it's a bug fix really. The bug fix is the discrepancy between the capacity filter and the filter wear, capacity wear. Those two things calculate the same factors in different ways and get different numbers. And so this is a fix for that, which implements the capacity factors algorithm, which then both of those two features use. And then my follow-up is to expose those capacity factors. And I guess that would be a change to the API, and which would require a spec, which I haven't done yet. I just wanted to make sure that this was going to land first before I go through that process.
Yeah,
Right. To your question, the spec was slightly different. In that spec, I wrote it, so I can tell you, I went crazy with the inconsistencies on the naming and what they meant. That was my initial problem, is different parts of the code call the same thing, use the same name for different things. It was crazy. So the first thing that the spec did was, okay, this from now on, this is how we call things. And this is what each thing means. Then the idea was the patch fix a couple of inconsistency, a couple of provisioning calculations that were incorrectly, and how we were calculating the max over subscription ratio, which is apart. So it was not including all these things that Walter found, which is, okay, now, even if things mean what they mean, there are different pieces of the scheduler, the weigher, and the filter that use different things. And then we have people that are not reducing those numbers. And so it's an addition to that original spec, the bugs that he has found.
Yes,
That was a very trivial analysis that I did originally. And Walter is now doing a more thorough one.
yeah, and a lot of the basis for the factors themselves are based upon those definitions in that spec directly, and they're named almost exactly as to what they are in that spec. So that way it's consistent in that respect.
Okay. Yeah, just to reiterate my question, like I got the answer correctly. I was just asking like if the spec is a reference only, and now I understand that the naming was taken as a reference from the spec, and these are bug fixes. So okay, yeah, it's much
Yeah,
clearer to me.
the first thing I did, I was going to fix a couple of bugs, and then I realized that we didn't have a consistent naming, a document that says this is what Cinder consider each of these word names, because they are a little bit weird and everybody has gone crazy with them. What provisioned, allocated, what each of those mean. And those, yeah, those were the most problematic ones. Allocated, provisioned, what they meant for us.
Yes, and
After all, was used as the reference.
and as a side note, one of the requirements for drivers is to report provisioned capacity, and almost no drivers are doing that. There are a couple. SolidFire is one. I think Ceph might be one. It was only like two or three as compared to how many drivers that we have.
In
And
fact, it's not. That's not. We don't force that. You cannot report it. If I remember correctly, the spec says that. If a driver does not report provision capacity gigabyte data, we'll use the automatically calculated allocated capacity gigabyte as described below. So
yes,
it's don't want to report it, we'll do this other thing. Because a lot of people, it's expensive or they don't want to do it or whatever.
or some backends can't, like VMware, it can't. Anyway, all the more reason why we need to fix the issues with tracking the allocated capacity, because it is one of the key factors in the scheduler in deciding whether it can do something or not. And one of the reasons why I have discovered this is because with thick provisioning, we don't use allocated capacity at all to determine. We use reported capacity by the back end. And VMware driver happens to have this super awesome feature that lets you do lazy creates, which is a feature in place to overcome other VMware problems, really. And so you can create a volume, and the driver says, yeah, I created it, when all it did is like, I could create it, but I didn't. And so the consumption of that space is not accounted for on VMware side, so it reports that it still has the same amount of space available prior to that request. So the other problems with respect to the scheduler, getting updates on what's being reported takes so long that you could theoretically over provisioning by 2 or 3 times your thick provisioned back end because of this problem. Yeah, so I could go on and on about the scheduler. We have so many issues, and maybe Gork and I should talk about that separately, but there's a huge discrepancy in time in which the volume stats gets updated to the scheduler for volume creates, and specifically for deletes, we get an update almost immediately from the driver, but for creates we don't. So we could theoretically create a whole bunch of volumes in a very small window between the pool stats being reported, and we could over provision, especially for highly provisioned or utilized pools, because there's such a lag. And I think one of the things that I was thinking about was the scheduler knows that it just gave the okay to allocate on a particular pool, so why doesn't it automatically update that allocated capacity right then and there?
In theory, it does date it, right? In theory, it does. It has a method to exactly do that. I don't know if it has a bug, but in theory, it should be doing it. And that's one of the problems our customers at Red Hat complain. It's like I make the request, I make 5 requests, and suddenly the scheduler says it cannot create them. to wait 30 seconds, and now it can. And it's because the scheduler automatically thinks, even for thin volumes, it says if you have requested 1 GB, I will count as if you had used it fully. Even if the backend has not reported yet, I count it full. And it updates automatically its data, the stats.
Yeah, I think that's probably a bug then, because I'm not seeing that being accounted for at all from the
But
scheduler's
only
perspective.
for thin and not for thick. I haven't played too much with thick volumes, so maybe that's
Yeah,
yeah.
we had to switch everything completely to thick about a year ago because thin was causing us way too many other problems, more VMware problems. But yeah, we're primarily using thick, and some of our larger ones where we can't switch because they're too big, they're still on thin, but the over provision ratio is set to 1 to 1, so it's effectively thick, but it still goes through the thin algorithm. So therein lies another discrepancy, which one of my patches here in this topic actually fixes as well. But maybe I can talk with you about that, updating that allocated capacity issue offline or whatever.
Yeah, I'll go through your different batches so that we can get this in shape. And then, since there will be still a lot of things that don't work nicely in the scheduler, we can have a follow-up discussion on how to improve it further.
Okay,
Because
that sounds good.
one of the things I keep in my mind is something that you said when you said I use a single scheduler and I don't have a performance bottleneck.
Mm-mm.
Brought me to maybe we can use the DLM we have to select my main when blank, but it's a primary that does all the operations and the rest are just waiting there in case it's not primary. It's my mind will come back, but the tools driver, some of the drivers have a way to select. I don't know how it calls, but yeah, a single one that does all the operations, and the other ones are waiting.
I see. Yeah,
Scheduler.
even in
Oh,
our large deployments, we only deploy a single scheduler. We have typically 3 or 4 API uh, containers, and we only have one scheduler container and one uh, container for each individual backend or volume service as well. For what it's worth.
leader election. That's what some of the drivers allows you to do, to select a leader. So that would be, but you can deploy 3 schedulers. You could potentially, but have only one doing everything. So that way you don't have 3 schedulers, each with which a different worldview of the allocation. Because each one, when they create a volume, they discount that number of gigabytes. But the other two don't know about that. They have
Yeah.
no idea what that is. And we will also need this for the Cinder volume service when running active-active. Because if 3 of them are reporting capabilities, first of all, it's usually many backends an expensive operation. So it will be even more problematic for the backends if you have 3 services requesting that. So, yep, that's something I will probably look into, the leader election and how to add functionality to Cinder so that only one of the services does something.
Yeah, I could see how that would be a problem for multiple Cinder volume services for the same backend, because some of the patches that I just worked on were to update, decrement, and increment depending upon whatever action was happening, the allocated capacity, and only that particular instance that handled that particular request is going to get that update. The others aren't.
Yep.
That's a different problem. Okay. But
I
I
think
guess I'm done with this. If anybody has any questions with respect to this, you go ahead and ask them now, or you can get hold of me on RC. It's fine. I'll be really glad to get these patches in.
so I think we are in agreement that we need to fix the calculations in the scheduler. And Walter has 2 patches proposed, and I guess he will be proposing more patches for the same. And okay, I think there are not much action items here, rather than just to review the patches proposed by Walter. Just all adding it to the Etherpad.
Well, thank you guys.
Okay, so for the next topic, I'm just taking Brian's word that it's not very important, so I've moved it again. Like Walter has another topic for the affinity and anti-affinity. So Brian, if you don't mind uh, discussing that before your topic.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, just wanted someone to press that button since Jay is doing it.
Yep,
I'm sorry
I
to
did.
ask. Okay,
I already did. It's Walt Day.
I guess. Jeez.
just like that.
All right. So this one is one that I recently discovered um, through talking with my manager and some of the reasons why we need to do affinity and anti-affinity within Cinder. And one of the deficiencies of the current implementation of Cinder is that the affinity and anti-affinity is not maintained. So the way it currently works within Cinder is a filter within the scheduler that allows you to provide when you create a volume, you provide a hint to the scheduler to say, I want to create a volume and I want to make sure it lands on the same host as this existing volume, or not the host for a particular existing volume or volumes. That works just fine. The problem is when you go to migrate a volume, that affinity is not kept anywhere, and we need to maintain that affinity somewhere. So that way we never migrate it to a particular host or backend at any point in time. And that information for that scheduler hint is not kept anywhere after the volume has been created. And there's no mechanism currently that I can think of that would allow us to keep it around. One would be to add some sort of metadata for that scheduler to hint. So when you migrate, you reuse it. But if you delete one of the original volumes that was in the affinity or anti-affinity scheduler hint, then you can't look up the host because the volume doesn't exist anymore. So I guess what I'm asking is I can't. I'm asking for help on deciding how to ensure that after the volume is created, that affinity and anti-affinity is maintained. So that's the topic. That's the question, because I don't know how to do that. I can't think of how to do it.
So the hint, as far as specifying affinity and anti-affinity, it's only other volume IDs that you're putting in there, or are you putting hosts in there?
It's the way the current it's called the different host filter or the same host filter, and it requires volume UUIDs.
Okay.
So you do cinder create -- hint same underscore host equals, and then a list of UUIDs.
But the scheduler could translate it, and wherever we store it, we would not be storing it as volume UUID, but as the internal representation, right? If we were to store it to be useful, like you said, You cannot keep it as a UID of something that can be removed, so you would have to store it as a host.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you would store it as a UUID of a volume for the anti-affinity case, because otherwise, when you deleted the other volumes, you would still have restrictions that you don't want anymore. You can't just do it as tracking hosts, or you won't be able to keep the right behavior over time.
True, because the other volume could be migrated, and then, yep, you would still need to hit that affinity or anti-affinity. But this creates a bunch of, this is a lot more complicated, because if I have an affinity and I move and I retype one volume of that, I may force everything to move 100 other volumes because they are with an affinity hint to be with that one. So I create one volume and I create 100 one with a hint, yeah, I want it with this one. Now I migrate the first one and everything goes after that. That could be crazy.
Yeah, that would be crazy. I don't think that is my understanding of what I want to accomplish, because that would be insane. You'd be moving every volume all the time. Um, I think my initial request with respect to this is that at the time the volume was created, they wanted an anti-affinity to where that original volume exists right now, and to maintain that moving forward. So if the original volume moves or is deleted, it's impossible for Cinder to track and automatically move volumes based upon the affinity or anti-affinity of that original volume. I think that's unreasonable.
But
Super awesome if it would automatically work, but
from a user perspective, that's actually what you want. Not on creation, but always to be that way. For example, if you are deploying your Galera cluster, you definitely want your disk to be on different, like separated. Don't put them together, because then if that dies, my whole database dies. That's the whole point of the anti-affinity one. Well, or at least the main one I can think of. So if that doesn't get preserved, and suddenly the administrator needs a space on that backend and migrates my volume, then suddenly I no longer get the value that I wanted with those two volumes of being in different places.
yeah, you're no longer compliant to the original affinity or anti-affinity rules.
Exactly.
So we need to kind of at some point spell out the model of what's actually supposed to happen with these constraints, because in the volume creation scenario, it's pretty straightforward, I think, where basically if you can't satisfy their constraint, you just fail to create, right?
Yeah.
So in the situation you're talking about later on with migration or whatever else, I don't know if this comes into backup restores and that kind of thing too. We'd have to decide, do you reject migration operations because you can't satisfy them, or do you make it a best effort kind of thing where it tries to do the right thing, but maybe it can't, and then it just kind of does something else? I'm not too clear what the model should be yet.
Yeah, it's currently right now you have the impression that at creation time everything is totally fine, and I don't know what people or users of this filter expect moving forward after the volume has been created, and especially with respect to the parent volume, if you will. It's almost like a replication and needing to constantly move things around. It seems bizarre, but I guess if you really want anti-affinity to a particular host for restore regions or to ensure that you're kind of crash resistant in that respect, then yeah, we should be moving things around. But we don't have anything like that currently in Cinder.
But I think this would need to be a new feature altogether because it would be not a hint on creation, but a trait that you want your volumes to have together, one with the other. And that, so a hint is just, right now I want it to be created in a different location. It's not for the rest of its life. It must uh, follow that rule. I think that is, like we say, a different thing. If you enforce that, you also make it life harder for the system administrator because I want to evacuate a backend because I bought a new one. So I'm going to move everything. Oops, I cannot do that because I have affinity and anti-affinity rules. I cannot do it. It also makes the other feature that you were talking about harder. The one about I need to extend, I have to move it. Suddenly have to move a bunch of volumes because they all have affinity together. So suddenly the feature, which I think it's awesome, if users could set that and we could make it work, it would be awesome. Makes everything harder. And
Yeah.
it's that we actually have to think through a lot, which I think is what you're asking. For everybody can come with something.
Yes. Yep. I mean the most simplistic approach that I had in my mind was just saving the list of hosts and whether it was affinity or not in the volume metadata, and then keeping that around when you're migrating the dependent volume, but not even exploring the idea of what happens if you move the original volume that I have affinity or anti-affinity for. That wasn't even a thought in my mind. So that obviously greatly complicates everything. And
I think Eric made a very important point in that the host is irrelevant. What you care about is the original volume. And if the original volume is deleted, then your affinity anti-affinity rule is free to do whatever it wants. If I have to be together with a volume but the volume disappear, I can go wherever I want. If I have to be somewhere that volume is not and it disappears, I can go anywhere I want. So the relevant information is the volume ID, not the host. The host is relevant in terms of keeping the rule, keeping
okay,
true to that restriction. I think Eric is correct on that one.
okay, yeah, that makes sense. I guess is then if we even if we implement the simplistic approach that I'm kind of suggesting, because it's more than what we have now, which it's not perfect, and we have many other things in Cinder that aren't perfect, but um, I would still need to be able to have a place to store all of these UUIDs because you can provide a list of them, and there isn't necessarily a limit to it currently, I think, in the API. Maybe there is, I don't know. But they can provide 10 of them, right? Where do we store that? I don't know if the metadata is the right place for it. Do I create another table just to store these? Anyway, so that's also a question.
I think another thing is, especially with the affinity thing, and if something migrates and it causes a cascade, we may need to allow an operator to say you get 5 traits or something. So you can't do this for every volume that you own, but you get to you got a set of 5 traits and you can use them as you want. But once you hit that capacity, you can't do it anymore.
So limiting to 5 traits. So in this case, the trait is affinity or anti-affinity.
Yeah.
because we
Because
don't
I think
have
it's
filters for other things like this for traits. Capabilities, I guess, similar, but
I don't know. Maybe it's not something. I'm just worried about if we implement something that can cause a cascade and you have to move a massive amount of stuff, we would probably want to throttle that somehow, but not just. I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking this. I think it's not just a permission thing. You can either do it or you can't. I think we'd have to somehow, right? The gold customers who pay extra can do this for like 50 volumes, but like a regular person, with your account, you can do it for 3.
I see. To limit the cost of the cascades and the number of
Yeah.
cascades. Yeah.
But we still have a lot more problems with this affinity and affinity, and that is what happens if you have 5 or 3, I don't care, and you move one, move the second, and the third fail. What do you do?
Yeah.
Now, because I think what we kind of lack in Cinder is kind of a service or a thread or however you want to say that does actual job and retries and sees if it can complete, if it can pick up a request that was left over. We don't have anything. So what happens is that you cross your finger that your running operations always complete. If they don't, yeah, this is bad.
And
Which
when it
would
fails, I spend the rest of my day tracking it down, and then cleaning it all up.
So I think this requires quite a bit of thought, feature, but I think it's potentially a good one in terms of usefulness. Yes, not sure how many of your customers actually need this to be preserved over time, because this could be a major effort kind of thing.
It is a major effort. That's why I'm kind of bringing it up. So the funny thing about that phrase is the number of customers. Unfortunately, the number doesn't necessarily matter as much as the who the customer actually is in this case. For some of the features that I have to fix and implement, it's the who is the most important part, not the number.
I think
So
maybe the short-term thing is we do need to make clear somewhere that our current understanding of what the affinity is for is just on creation, so that you shouldn't have this expectation that it's going to be carried through. And that if you have, I guess you would have to contact the operator. If you have some particular case where you do need this to happen, we don't have a mechanism to handle that right now.
Well, and it would be affinity and any other hint stuff that we support, which there's
Okay.
the instance locality filter is similar to the affinity stuff, but it's a similar kind of thing. Honestly, I don't think I've heard hardly anybody in years talk about using our scheduler hints for anything. They do a couple things, but they seem to be pretty rarely used from anything that I ever hear. So there's probably not much documentation or anything on that stuff.
no, I don't think there is. I just had to implement this affinity anti-affinity filter for some of our deployments, and I just discovered the idea that we're not carrying through this affinity at all, except for creation time, which is a problem, which is why I brought this up. So as SAP becomes more and more dependent upon a lot of features within Cinder, I'm discovering some of these things as I go.
So I have one thing to ask. Maybe it is too dumb. So, like, instead of preserving that with the creation of the volume, can we do it something like when we are doing an operation, like when we are migrating that volume and provide that affinity at that time? Uh, is it feasible, or it makes it more complex?
Well,
It would be feasible, but I don't think that helps because the person that creates the volume may not be the one migrating the volume.
yeah, and I guess that's where where I was coming from is having a place to store this affinity, anti-affinity hint somewhere, and then the simplest case of at the next operation time applying that affinity rule that's saved on that particular volume and not worrying about this parental volume cascade issue whatsoever. Which, if you're really implementing affinity anti-affinity, the gold standard, that's what you would do. Um, but having some sort of, okay, we're kind of getting by with this kind of cases, I don't know if that would even be acceptable. I have to talk about that with the rest of my team, but um, it's better than what we have now, which is a one and done kind of thing, and then that hint and information is lost, not saved anywhere. Maybe it's in a log somewhere, but that's about it.
Yeah, I guess the Cinder model, right, is migrations are done by operators when they need to move stuff, and they're only done indirectly by users when they retype a volume because they have the option to say fail if the retype requires movement or
Mm-hmm.
go ahead and do it, but they have no idea where it's going or anything like that.
Yeah.
But even if they don't know where it is going, maybe they still want to preserve the
Right,
affinity.
right. Yeah, no, because I was thinking a simple thing would be like what Rajat was saying was just, hey, migrate it, and by the way, don't put it near this guy because I want them far away. But we have no way of knowing that.
Yes. We have no
With
way of knowing that. Hmm. And some of our customers know that we're using Cinder, so they know it lands on a particular host and pool and whatnot, and they're the ones who are saying, "Hey, these can't be on the same place. We need those to be even on different net apps, which are behind our VMware instance, and they can't even be on there. They need to be on different places than that because hey, it's a requirement of their business model to ensure that the integrity of in case a fire happens or everything blows up. And we've actually run into cases where we've had a deployment in an availability zone go down and the other one was still there. So it's I need some sort of answer for this, and I don't even know what it is at this point.
Well, the problem at this point is that the solution would be availability zones. That's how I would get by with real availability zones and fake availability zones. So you would have volume types that specify fake availability zones, which are basically different arrays in types that say any of them is fine.
Yeah,
So that set the affinity in the volume type because the volume types now accept availability zone in there. And then it's got since they are two different volume types, they are going to two different backends for sure. Even if they are both NetApp, they are different availability zones.
Yeah, I did something similar. I created a new affinity anti-affinity filter, which keys off of a custom value that's being reported by the VMware driver. And this custom value is populated at get volume stats time. It tracks the FQDN of the actual NetApp behind the data store itself. And then the new filter is affinity or anti-affinity to that value. So even within the same vCenter, if we have multiple NetApps behind it, if we have anti-affinity, it lands on the other NetApp, even within the same vCenter. It's kind of a fake AZ, if you will. So it accomplishes this in that respect, but only at creation time. So would it be acceptable for a short-term addition to save this information somewhere in Cinder and for migration to or any other actions actually that go through the scheduler to utilize that saved information? Not talking about the cascade issue whatsoever, but actions against the newly created volume that has the affinity or anti-affinity. So if we save that information and the scheduler automatically gets it, it will utilize it, basically. Just as if someone provided the hint in the API.
But then how to even migrate it, right? The affinity may be easier, but the affinity, if you tell me to be with this one, and you tell me migrate, I'm going to say, nope, I want to be with this one, right?
Well, if we save it and we have affinity to a particular volume, we always want to stay with it. And migration, if you're forcing it to go somewhere else, it would fail in that case.
So your new feature of extend would fail because it tries to migrate it, and the hint prevents it from migrating and from extending, and now try to debug that thing when it failed. It's like, why did it fail if I added a new feature to migrate my volumes?
Right.
Well,
In this case, our affinity isn't to a particular pool. Our affinity is to a particular NetApp behind the pool. So in this case, it would work. But in terms of generic Cinder affinity filters, yes, it would fail in that case. Yes.
we would need then to have a feature be able to remove the hint so that the users can then move around the limitation. Like, I want to move it. Nope, it has a hint. Let me clear the hint. Now do it. And things
Yeah.
like that.
Or a force flag that says, no, really do it anyway.
Eric is going to say no to the force flag. I can already tell you that. No more force anything because crazy's in there.
Okay.
But
Yeah, so there's
yeah,
no real easy answer then, I guess. An alternative is to ensure that that hint can be passed at any volume action, I guess, and then put it on the users. But
well, if so, the hint, who provides the hint? The user or the volume type, or who provides that hint? The user, right?
the user at create, yeah, they have to actually pass it on the as part of Cinder client. You have to put it on the command line. I don't know if
Has
I
to
don't.
be a fit thing because they are the ones that provide it. They must be able to clear it, see it, and do all kinds of operation on it.
Yes.
That must always be. If we add it and store it, it should be visible. So why not just stuff it as metadata, normal metadata?
Yeah, that's fine. If we want to put it metadata on that volume because it's actually on that volume, I'm okay with that too.
So if you do that, you still have to think through what do you do with backup restores and replication and those kinds of things. And when do you apply it when you're restoring a volume?
Yeah. Yep.
True.
Yeah, I haven't thought through all this. This is a new to me. I just discovered this yesterday, so
But yeah, we could write a spec, and I think it is true that it's going to be that the full-blown feature is going to be near impossible to implement for us because with all the issues that we currently have, this is probably not the full-blown feature high priority, but having something that at least tries, it's probably better than nothing.
yes, which is what we have now. Almost nothing. You have affinity when you create it, and after that,
Is there any chance that Nova has already solved a very similar problem? Just since it seems likely that they might have a solution, we would at least want to look at how they do it.
yeah, I don't know.
I think they do it in their server groups stuff.
So I think we can think about this more in the development cycle, and we can also look at Nova for reference and jot down all the points in a spec. So we can have a clear discussion there.
Okay, cool.
I think the general agreement is to like this could be useful, so it's better to do it, but it still has we still have to define things like how to do it and the most efficient way and take in consideration of all the cases.
I do like the storing in metadata idea though, because it's gives the user control. We already have that functionality. People know how to use it, so
So
that's kind of cool.
what is the limit for the metadata, like the volume
I think
UIDs?
it's
If we have plenty of them,
I think it
solve the
would be
problem.
255 characters. Um, so I'm not sure how many UUIDs you can slap in there.
And probably not a lot, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to provide a giant list of volumes for anti-affinity or affinity. You'll eventually be anti-affinity to everything. Create this volume, but don't create it anywhere. Okay.
It's a virtual volume then.
Yes.
So I guess we are towards the end of the PTG of day one. And if there are no other points to discuss about this topic, like we can discuss it in the next upcoming Cinder meetings, and we can have this discussion continued in the mid-cycle as well when we have more information about this. But this was a good, productive initial discussion. So,
Okay, cool. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
okay, I will just stop the recording now.